combination of liquid oxygen and what was called rocket propellant 1, which is a super clean, super refined version of kerosene. In order to produce that kind of power, if you combine the weights of the kerosene and the liquid oxygen, each engine consumed 3 tons per second. That's 30,000 pounds of fuel and oxygen every second total. Now, in order to pump that much into those engines, each engine has a huge fuel pump on it called a turbo pump. The turbo pump for one engine alone produced 55,000 horsepower. That's as much power as 30 diesel locomotives. Now, as it lifted off the pad, it produced, I'm going to go ahead and start walking. As it lifted off the pad, the noise level that it produced was so loud, it was one of the most loudest sounds ever produced by man, short of an atomic explosion. The vibration of it in the ground were triggered earthquake detectors as far away as New York State. And if anything alive was out in the open within half a mile of the launch pad when it lifted off, it would have been killed instantly, just from the sound level. Now, when it's burning rate at that amount, it has to carry an immense amount of fuel and liquid oxygen. In fact, out of that 6.5 million pound total weight, 4.5 million pounds was just the fuel and liquid oxygen inside that first stage. That's about 69.5% of the total vehicle weight is just fuel in the first stage. Now, even with that much fuel, it burned through all of it in only 2.5 minutes. After that 2.5 minutes, it had accelerated the entire spacecraft and launch vehicle to a speed of 6,000 miles per hour, which is about 9 times the speed of sound, and it reached an altitude of 42 miles. Now, that's not nearly high enough or fast enough to get into orbit or even into space. So, as it ran out of fuel, they shut the engines down, and then they fired explosives in a ring that held the first and second stages together. Then there were small rockets that pushed the first stage away from the rest of it, and at that point, the second stage engines fired. Now, you can see it also has 5 engines, but let's keep in mind that out of that initial weight of 6.5 million pounds, it had just lost 4.8 million pounds of weight. So those 5 engines didn't need to be as big. Their total thrust together was 1.1 million pounds, which is less power than just one of those engines on the first stage. Now, these didn't burn kerosene. Instead, they burned liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. Now, as you can imagine, when that first stage is burning kerosene, it's producing a lot of smoke and toxic gases. When these engines fire, you only see a little bit of smoke, but can anybody tell me what that smoke is actually made of?
Water.
You're burning hydrogen and oxygen.
Water.
Exactly, water. So what looks like smoke is actually superheated pure steam. Now, this rocket stage burned for 8 minutes. During that time, it's going to continue pushing the remaining spacecraft and booster assembly up to a final altitude of 102 miles and reaching a speed of 17,000 miles per hour. Now, that's high enough to get into orbit, but it's not quite fast enough. The magic number for reaching orbital velocity is 17,500 miles per hour. So as this runs out of fuel, they shut the engines down, and then they release the second stage and it falls back. Now, both the first and second stages, when they release them, they're just going to fall back. They're going to crash into the ocean, break up into thousands of pieces, and sink to the bottom. There's no way in the world that they could ever be reused. And in fact, over the last 50 years, they've only found a few pieces of them on the bottom of the ocean. Now, as soon as that second stage separates and falls away, the third stage fires. And you can see, excuse me a second here. Yeah, we're going to have to cut through here. The third stage has just one of those same engines used on the second stage, and they're going to only fire it for about 2.5 minutes to begin with, because all they're really needing to do is to speed it up to 17,500 miles per hour. And so once they reach that speed, they cut the engine off. They're now at 17.5, and they're at an altitude of about 105 miles, and they're now in low Earth orbit. Now, they want to go to the moon, but they're still not quite ready to do that. They need to check out all the systems in the Apollo spacecraft, in the lunar lander, and also in the third stage here to make sure that everything is working absolutely perfectly. Once they're certain that it is, they fire this engine again at exactly the right moment, usually after 1.5 orbits, and they perform what's called a translunar injection. What this means is they've now sped up to 25,000 miles per hour, which is called escape velocity. That's how fast you have to go to completely pull away from the pull of Earth's gravity. And then the other thing is it puts them on a precise path to the moon. Now let's walk up a little bit more. Now they shut that engine off and they don't need it anymore, but they didn't get rid of it yet, because bolted to the top of it is this tapered section, and as we walk by you can see it's hollow inside. This is called the lunar lander adapter. That's where they store the lunar lander with its legs all folded up during launch. And they're just about ready to get that out of there. But before we talk about that, we're going to walk up a little bit more, because I want to point out at the very top of the rocket assembly, there's a tower that has 4 rocket nozzles on it. That's called the launch escape system. This was a very important safety device. During the first stages of launch, when that first stage is burning, that's the most dangerous time of the mission. If anything malfunctions seriously in that first stage, they're literally sitting on top of a 4.5 million pound bomb. So if there's a major malfunction, computers on the Saturn V detect it, they fire that escape tower, and it pulls that Apollo spacecraft at least a mile away so that the rest of the booster can be safely exploded and disposed of, and the astronauts' lives are saved. Now, that was never necessary. So after the first stage quits firing, they drop it off, and then they ignite the second stage. And this is only about 3 minutes into the initial flight. Once that second stage is firing, they fire rockets on that escape tower and they remove it. That's important because once they're up on orbit, and now certainly once they're on their way to the moon, they don't want that anywhere around them, because they're about to get that lunar lander. Now what we have at this point is the third stage with the adapter with the lunar lander inside it. Above that, that gray and white section is called the service module. And then on top of that, at the very top now, is the Apollo spacecraft without that escape tower. Now, that service module is important because it has most of their water